Hi, I'm Allan, and this is a talk about what we do in the Data Science and Systems Integration program at NSLS-II. Our challenge is to take all the new requirements that our scientists and the visiting facility users dream up and deliver them in a reliable way, in spite of the fact that these requirements are changing all the time, without using too much duct tape. Beamline scientists are really good at coming up with new ways that they want to use their beamline instruments to do science. That's the part of the job. And beamline users are also really good at coming up with new ways to use the instruments, often on the spot, and that creativity drives the science. We like that. But it does make the job pretty challenging for the people who have to make both the controls part of the instrument and the data analysis downstream continuously working in the context of all of that change. Way back in the beginning of synchrotrons were actually controlled with bicycle brake cables and shifter cables that could do things like adjust shutters and move things around. And that was a pretty simple way to work. One person could pretty much understand that entire system and keep the whole thing running. Now in 2024, we have 1,000 networked devices on our beamline instruments and 2,300 devices in the accelerator. So it takes a lot of different kinds of skills to keep those systems working. If we compare to, say, the James Webb Space Telescope, which I'll say has a comparable amount of complexity, we're a little jealous of them because that system was really carefully defined very far in advance, and the people who are controlling it and managing the data downstream of it had lots of time to think ahead about how they were going to do that. On a random Tuesday, they don't have a new idea and just send somebody to space to tack on an additional detector in space. That doesn't happen to them. But at the beamlines, that's a pretty normal Tuesday. So how do we cope with this challenge? We use sound planning and engineering to set ourselves up for success. We use abstraction so that the same solution can be repurposed in different ways. And we collaborate with each other, both within the building, around the sites in the US, and around the world. So when I was in graduate school, we had a rheometer, which we used to use our measurements, and it was connected to the printer across the way by a cable that was sort of maybe duct taped to the wall in places and might have run across the ceiling. And depending on your personality, that might bother you or not, but it didn't interfere with the way that we did our science. At the scale that you can see in this picture, with thousands of cables very carefully plugged into the correct port, you can see that if somebody didn't have deep professionalism and knowledge and expertise and detail-oriented care to do that, you'd have a huge mess. Even if you got it working, the minute one thing breaks, you're looking at weeks or who knows how long to fix it. It takes a really particular set of skills to manage even cabling at this scale. If I were going to build a doghouse, I like to think that I could probably do that on the first try, or at least the second try. I might even be able to add a doorbell or a light. I can do that. But then if I tried to transfer those skills to building a real house, that would not go well, right? At a certain scale, there's an inherent complexity, and it takes people with many different skills working together to pull that off. The second tool I mentioned is abstractions. So there's a joke about physicists that if you give a physicist a problem, a math problem involving a cow, they will approximate the cow as a sphere because it makes the math easier, and cows are vaguely round, right? So that should work. In the same way, in controlling synchrotrons, we have an abstraction called EPICS, stands for Experimental Physics and Industrial Control Systems, that abstracts all hardware as kind of a spherical cow in its own way. EPICS was actually invented for the Star Wars program, not like lightsabers Star Wars, but lasers in space in the Ronald Reagan era Star Wars, and then repurposed to control mostly experimental physics and industrial systems. And it basically smooths over the details of all the complexity of the devices. And it says basically, which computer do I have to talk to control this device? What's its current value, measurement, or position? I want to set it to a new value, and you should tell me when it gets there. And then please send me updates if anything changes. And that pretty much captures everything we need to know for a device at the science level. And that view of the world, that simpler view of the world, keeps the device-specific details from overwhelming us. Now, someone had better know those device-specific details at some point to set that up. But then when things are operating, you should be able to walk up to a working device and not know all those details and still be able to do things with it. That's the value of abstraction. Blue Sky, which was developed originally at NSLS-II, is another level of abstraction on top of that is kind of like a Mad Libs for a science experiment. You fill in the blanks on which sorts of motor you want to move or which sorts of detector you're going to use, and the same general logic of, say, running a grid pattern or a spiral or some sort of adaptive, reactive experiment that's looking at the results as it goes and deciding what to do. That same logic might be repurposed at different instruments around NSLS-II or even around the world. In the same way, when we think about data analysis, we know that data can come out of detectors in all sorts of formats, just like dealing with a spreadsheet format from one program or a document from a different program, and those specific details can get in our way. So we try to think at the level of an image or at the level of a table, rather than getting stuck at the level of JPEG versus GIF versus PNG or something like that. The third tool that we use is collaboration, and we have peers who have similar jobs and similar instruments all around the world. And while each instrument has its own unique capabilities and its own particular details that you need to know, by working openly, we're able to quickly get through the rote stuff and focus on the parts of the job that make it interesting and fun, and maybe the special capabilities that we have that no one else does. So we tend to work publicly on the internet. The site-specific details and the credentials for security are internal, but those are boring anyway. Everything else we more or less share in DSSI. And that way people can reuse and repurpose our work for free. We benefit from discovering connections to related efforts, collecting ideas for capabilities or approaches that we might want ourselves but didn't think of here. We hear about problems that we might run into in the future but hadn't run into yet. And we have new capabilities that are contributed back to us by others who are using the same project. This is not a new idea. I was told by Greg Wilson, who's the founder of Data Carpentry nonprofit, that the first conference with the word open source and open science in the title was held at Brookhaven in 1999. This is a screenshot of that. But in the years since, through tools like GitHub and other sharing platforms for code and data, collaboration is a lot more practical than it used to be. And so it doesn't cost us much to work together. We also have 24/7 worldwide community chats where people from the Australian light source or the Diamond light source in the UK might be answering questions and asking questions, and then you wake up in the US and you get to kind of catch up on that worldwide group of peers, software staff, and scientific staff working together. An example of what this can enable, when you have a shared platform like EPIX and Blue Sky, two different instruments that do very different experiments can talk to each other, share data streams, and coordinate how they want to spend their time analyzing data. So this is an example where the same sample, as I understand it, was snapped in half, and half of it studied at the PDF instrument and half of it studied at the BMM instrument, where they then coordinated the data streams with an AI-enabled brain to make the most of the experiment time and study the most interesting portions of the sample. And so with these three tools in our toolbox, we set ourselves up to be able to provide many exciting scientific capabilities with just a little bit of duct tape.